Hello everybody, and welcome back to Cam Critiques. Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is out tomorrow, and I couldn't be more excited. But, before we move on to the future of the franchise, I like to look back at what we've already gotten over the years. So today, I'll be going through the 3 prior titles in the Xenoblade series, ranking each one. Let's get started with number 3. Number 3. Xenoblade Chronicles. Xenoblade Chronicles is a great game, don't get me wrong. It's got an interesting story, tons of systems to mess around with, and an outstanding soundtrack. But I think it's the weakest in the series for many reasons. First of all, this game's exploration is, in my opinion, kind of bad. When I play games like this with big open areas that are ideally filled with things to do, I like to explore as much as I can. Filling out a map is always super satisfying. However, in Xenoblade 1, it's just not worth the insane time commitment. In areas such as Aerith Sea, you have to spend literal hours swimming aimlessly to find everything. In Valak Mountain, you're forced to wander in a straight line through a blizzard for far too long. And nothing you find is ever all that rewarding. Those hours of swimming through Aerith Sea got me half a level of experience and a couple pieces of armor I never used. You move so slowly, and the areas here are just so massive. Even if you don't want to thoroughly explore, you'll have to spend tons of time walking in straight lines through barren fields to get from one objective to another. The latter half of the game isn't nearly as bad as the first half with regard to obnoxious navigation, but that's largely because the areas become far more linear. It's a shame that I had more fun making my way through a game that prides itself on wide open areas, once they started to grow a lot smaller in scope. Even some of the towns are a pain to navigate. Alchemoth, the High Entia capital, has always stood out to me as perhaps the worst town I've seen across all of my extensive RPG experience. It's incredibly barren. It doesn't even have any houses in it despite apparently being a massive capital. And it's far too large. Picking up all the side quests here requires multiple consecutive hours of running back and forth through a massive, empty field with nothing but a couple benches and fountains. More often than not, just getting around in Xenoblade 1 is a massive pain. Speaking of side quests, that's another distinct weak point for this game. The side quests here are plentiful, though they're pretty much all boring fetch quests. You're overloaded with the most menial tasks imaginable at each and every town or settlement. In fact, this game has a time system, and different times of day have different quests, which makes the process of picking every quest up that much more tedious. And it really doesn't help that doing these quests is necessary to access some actual well thought out post-game content. Luckily, you're not missing out on too much if you don't trudge your way through boring quest after boring quest. The unlockable content here mainly consists of super bosses, and with combat as shallow as it is, I had little to no interest in fighting them. Xenoblade 1's combat is far from bad. It's a great foundation that the future entries built on in really interesting ways. But those wrinkles added in subsequent titles were really important. As it is here, the combat primarily consists of waiting around, occasionally moving through the same flowchart of moves that take a while to charge up again and again in every battle. If you learn the intricacies of the blade system and the combo system in particular in Xenoblade 2, you can easily take on enemies much higher level than you. In Xenoblade 1, you barely do any damage unless your level is close to that of your foe. This game kind of plays itself, merely using levels as a way to force you to grind. I'm sure if you really dive into systems like the Gem Forge, you can bypass some of these restrictions, but any casual player definitely won't. Worst of all the problems though are the issues I have with how Xenoblade Chronicles tells its story. Don't get me wrong, this story is great. I think, simply looking at a summary, it should be the best in the franchise. However, it's told in a way that is super obnoxious. Character growth is practically non-existent throughout Xenoblade 1. Some characters are irrelevant for most of the game. Ricky is there to pay off debt. That is his entire motivation. This never changes. Melia gets a 10-hour arc that awkwardly interrupts the main story's progression once you encounter her, and then she becomes irrelevant for the next 30 hours, barely speaking in most cutscenes. The story told here isn't that of the party, it's pretty much just that of Shulk. And as interesting as that story is, I don't like how everything's spaced out. The first half of this game stacks question upon question on top of one another, not revealing any answers until much later, which, while it leads to a particularly interesting ending, I'm not a fan of. After I left the first area, no cutscene was particularly exciting until many hours and areas later. And this game's plot gets sidetracked a lot, sometimes for far too long. Again, Melia's 10-hour, barely relevant arc is pretty egregious. I do like Xenoblade Chronicles, especially the Switch remaster. The game is worth playing if you're a JRPG fan. However, in my opinion, it's got a lot of issues that hold it back. I didn't really start considering myself a Xenoblade fan until I got my hands on later entries. Luckily, I like both of them much more. Xenoblade has shallow combat, awkward pacing, and a really obnoxious environment design. But it set a great foundation for a franchise that has now become one of my favorites. Now, let's move on to the next entry in this list. Number 2. Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 seems to have split the opinions of a lot of Xenoblade fans, and it's pretty easy to see why. Its tone is vastly different, and I'd argue worse, than that of Xenoblade 1. And it does introduce a few new flaws. But I think that, overall, I like this game substantially more. A lot of my problems with Xenoblade 1 are addressed in this follow-up. The greatest improvement, in my opinion, is seeing the combat. This game has the blade system, which in many ways is kind of annoying. I don't like that to get worthwhile blades you have to get lucky with a bizarre gacha system. And I don't like how much stuff you have to grind out to fill your blade's affinity chart, and make your blade as good as it can be. But, once you had those blades, the combat becomes a lot more interesting. You have 3 movesets instead of 1, so there's always something you can be doing. And there's a lot more to consider with the blade combo system and the elemental typing of blades and enemies. The combat here is more strategic, and it's a lot more engaging. The story is also told in a much better way. There are no drafts of plot-related revelations, and the story is very character-driven. Every party member is relevant, and they all have genuine development. Sadly, I think that aside from the amazing connections to Xenoblade 1, the overarching plot is worse here. The villains are less menacing, and the mystery is less intriguing. The tone is also a lot more juvenile, which is probably my least favorite thing about this game. There are a lot of cringe-worthy moments, especially featuring Tora and his, maid schoolgirl robot. However, I would still say I prefer this game's narrative, simply because it's told in a way that is much improved over the original. Navigating areas is not nearly as cumbersome in this game as it is in the first Xenoblade. The locales still have an impressive scope, but none of them have tons of unused space that you're forced to slowly wander through. The exploration here isn't perfect though. This game adds the field skill system, where you'll need to have blades equipped with skills that can be earned through building their affinity charts to interact with things in the overworld. This is just another way to lock content behind grinding. But at least the content is mostly optional, and you do get some interesting rewards if you have all the necessary skills. I wish the side quests were more improved here, but they're not nearly as oversaturated as they are in the original game. A lot of them are still fetch quests, but there are also lots of interesting side stories built around unique blades, and collecting quests is never particularly cumbersome. I wish you could track them better in the menus, and I still dislike the whole time system locking quests behind it, but the side quests in this game are perfectly fine. Xenoblade 2 is far from a perfect game, but a few scenes aside, the story is interesting and well told. The combat is strategic, engaging, and fun, and the exploration is rewarding and rarely cumbersome. It also has a fantastic expansion in Torn of the Golden Country. I had a great time playing this game. There is still one Xenoblade game that I believe to be superior though. That being Number 1. Xenoblade Chronicles X. Xenoblade Chronicles X is by far the least played game in this series. It's tragically been stuck on the ill-fated Wii U for its entire life. But that's an absolute shame, because as far as I'm concerned, Xenoblade Chronicles X is the best game in the franchise and one of the best games ever made. Some Xenoblade fans were disappointed when X first released, and I don't find that particularly surprising. While the other Xenoblade titles are extremely plot-focused, the narrative takes a back seat here. I can totally see why this disappointed some. but I don't think this game needed a grand story to be great. There are some nice twists and a great tone, and Xenoblade X still feels like a fully realized experience. The relatively little emphasis on story feels intentional, with exploration being the main focus here. And that exploration is absolutely fantastic. There are so many beautiful, varied landscapes, so many hidden secrets. You can run fast through the world, and eventually you unlock a giant robot called a Skell, opening up so many more secrets and making navigation even less time consuming. The world is fun to explore on foot or from the air in your Skell in entirely different ways. There's nothing else quite like this game's world. The combat is pretty similar to that of the first Xenoblade game, though it has the added hook of a class system, and that class system is great. While the combat here isn't quite as engaging as that of Xenoblade 2, it's every bit as strategic. Skells also fight pretty differently from humans, and there's a lot of in-depth character building as well as in-depth Skell building. The side quests here are easily the best in the Xenoblade series thus far. I'd argue that a good chunk of side quest plotlines are more interesting than the main story in this game. And perhaps most impressive of all is this game's aesthetic. Every Xenoblade game has an incredible soundtrack, but this game's soundtrack is like no other. It's done by Hiroyuki Sawano, of Attack on Titan and Kill la Kill fame, and you can tell. It's got a bizarre techno vibe that's hard to describe. I think Xenoblade 2's soundtrack is a little better, but X's soundtrack is far more unique. And I still cannot comprehend how they got this game to work on the Wii U. It's gorgeous and it's gigantic. There's still nothing that comes anywhere close to being this technically impressive on the Switch, more than 5 years into its life cycle. Xenoblade X is a technical marvel, with great combat, a super unique and well executed aesthetic, and some of the greatest exploration in all of gaming. It's a game that I'll be coming back to for years to come, and I hope that Monolith Soft tries to make something more like this game again at some point in the future. Looking back, every Xenoblade game is great in its own way, though they all have their flaws. Xenoblade 1 has weird pacing, Xenoblade 2 has a somewhat obnoxious tone, and Xenoblade X doesn't have the epic story that the series is known for. But Xenoblade 3 looks like it could be the best entry yet. If it fully delivers in terms of tone, storytelling, and gameplay, it'll be something special. Thank you guys for watching this video, I really appreciate it. If you liked it, I'd also really appreciate it if you liked, commented, hit the notification bell, and or subscribed. I'd also recommend you check out some of my other content, like my review of the great Fire Emblem Warriors 3 Hopes. If you want to see additional updates about the channel, follow me on Twitter or Instagram, or join my Discord server. All links in the description below. Thank you all for watching, have a great rest of your day.